Hello, my name is Jeff Chase, and this is my final project for understanding how policies can impact cultures. So, Hofstede realized that within every culture, there are dimensions that act as barriers for communication. So, the ability to build connections and motivate people um, come down to understanding how the power distance is less or more. Whether that country or culture is individuals, whether they're organized, whether they're feminine or masculine, whether they depend on, do they worship goals? Are they oriented in that, or are they more focused on the relationships that they build? All these dimensions impact the nature of the way a certain company or organization would advertise based on these five criteria of power distance, individualism, masculinity, uncertainty, long-term orientation, and indulgence. So the scale that Hofstede has created is a 0 to 100 point scale, and it allows you the ability to understand the exact dimension at which a specific country may understand power, individualism, masculinity, um, long-term orientation, and indulgence. And so it's important that you familiarize yourself with the exact understanding to if they're very extremist or they're very mellow um, in the 0 to 100 point scale. So the 0 to 100 point scale that Hofstede's created is unique in that you can see the exact level or criteria that which a certain country may value a certain. This is a visual of the cultural consumer. Each, each cultural consumer has a mental, social, that impacts the overall personality of the consumer. So their ideals, their cultural values are all impacted by their social presence as well as their mental process. So this allows organizations to strategically craft their message to understand how they want to appeal or strategize their overall message to brand themselves to be a appealing source. So the advantages to understanding the Hofstede model is that you get a very clear and concise understanding of where your message is going and the type of audience that you will be engaging with. And allowing yourself to visualize and see the difference between international countries is a wonderful way to understand and set goals for your company and strategically implement and target that audience. But the disadvantages you may come across is that an employee or an employer may not clearly understand the motives or the purpose of engaging that specific medium. So it's important that you well train your employees to understand the cultural dimensions of this and argue that, and many researchers have argued that the Hofstede module it needs to be more broad, and that five dimensions is only limited to so much. So within the Hofstede module, we observe the way high and low context cultures can impact the model. A very brief overview of the high context cultures is cultures place a strong emphasis on communication and relationships, while low context cultures are very independent of each other and rely on quick and decisive conversation as opposed to long and intimate relationship-based communication. So a high context culture will rely heavily on interpersonal communication and nonverbal cues. In a high context communication setting, a message can't be understood without having a great deal of background information such as who, what, where, when, and why. Where countries such as Asia, Africa, Central Europe, Latin America cultures are generally considered to be high context cultures, they have a great deal of understanding the association, understanding the interaction of eye movement, gestures, facial gestures. They're very territorial people, so when it comes to sharing space, do they like to be independent or do they like to be in the same room working together? So these are all important things to factor in when dealing with cultural dimensions. A low context culture will rely explicitly on just factual communication. More the information the message is spelled out and defined, the less clutter habit there will be. There's not much need for association. Um, you know, being very independent and doing the work as independent as possible is the most important view for a low context culture, which is probably why the United States has been so successful in their marketing. So how relationships differentiate between high and low context cultures. Um, high context cultures prefer to be, you know, informal agreements over meticulously worded legal documents that a low context culture might associate themselves with. So, there's a big difference between the way these two societies go about handling themselves privately in public, and certainly in the way in which they hold tight knit friend groups and tend to block others out from the norm. So this is a visual context of understanding the way in which high context cultures and low context cultures come together. And as you can see, as they build up, um, you know, on the left, that's a higher context culture, and they tend to come together from a relationships perspective fairly well. And then in a low context culture, people tend to, because there's so many friend groups, because it's so independent and stagnant, that you will notice they tend to go apart from one another. So in conclusion, with two very different context cultures with high and low, um, low context cultures tend to be more specific and direct, um, while attention focuses more on what is said than the relationships that is formed. An example that we used throughout our module was in China or Japan. Words received less attention than their relationships, and there are more mutual understandings in nonverbal body gestures or facial gestures in those agreements. So just it's important to understand that the classification at which high and low context. Standardization versus adaptation was a very interesting topic that we covered throughout the course, in that should companies standardize their message to global markets or adapt their message to global markets? Standardization has been around forever and it's been used by many marketers, but people feel that adaptation might be better because it allows a unique feel, and it's a little more advantageous as it comes to meeting the customer's needs and desires. For example, if you were looking at McDonald's, who was a particular burger that is based in the United States, and then they put a burger, a McDonald's in, let's say, Egypt or Paris, it might be a different cultural need that they might want. For example, if you were to take a burger place and put it in Asia, they might want a seafood selection as opposed to a beef selection or a chicken selection. So depending on that government, that culture, that what that culture may value, it will differentiate the way you adapt your message or you standardize your message. It just depends on the best exact way for your company overall. So why is this so important? And it really comes down to the online population. As Dave Chafee pointed out in his PEW research in the 27 media that we covered, the total population online is right around 8 billion people. And with roughly 4 billion people being online, that's a significant number of online users, especially with growing user demographics in East Asia, South Asia, Africa, West Europe. Predominantly, third world countries, this number is growing rapidly. And to be understood of how quickly these are growing is understanding that as you become more international, more and more people will become more familiar with your product. And so it's important that you develop the policies and regulations to meet the standards of the overall population of the world. Policies and regulations online, because of the amount of people that are online in international demographics, it's important that these policies and procedures provide a clarity to the reader or the user online when dealing with accountability issues or activities that are important to a company or an organization, such as the safety or health or the legal liabilities or hackings or scams, etc. And so these issues are important that your company is safeguarded from the overall public. And depending on the type of government a country is under, that media is either owned privately or publicly. So understanding where your media or your message is being targeted toward is also important. As I mentioned in the last slide, the social media policies just provide a clear and concise guidelines for communities online. Um, so being able to set expectations of what you can do online or you can do, this allows organizations to represent and understand what is wrong or right to do. And understanding, posting obscure photos, threatening photos, harassing employees, being discriminative, or being hateful, hate speech. So being able to provide clear values and cultures for customers, employees, and the public alike are so important. And this just allows for companies to reduce lost time and spend time regulating, or not regulating, but understanding that there's consequences for these actions. So the beauty of freedom of expression online is one of the things that makes the internet so unique and different, and it's such a wonderful thing. But oftentimes, in conclusion, when we are dealing with high context and low context cultures throughout the world internationally, it's important that we understand Hofstede's model of the 5 to 6 criteria that which we mentioned earlier. It's important that we familiarize ourselves with each culture and we understand what is important, what that culture values to make the best marketing or advertising strategy of that particular company. Once we've understood the proper implications to take to address that certain country, it's important that we standardize or adapt our communication theory to best effectively address that medium. And once we have done so, it's important that we regulate and monitor our social media posts on a constant basis to ensure the safety and the legal issues of our organization are well kept. And we do so by placing a very clear and specific and concise legal hyperlink that lets each customer or visitor know that various hate speech, derogatory postings are not allowed. And so social media has created an open platform and playground for that certain medium. But it's important that we ensure the overall committedness to the overall organization. Thank you.